For this last panel today, we have kept something which probably will raise a lots of discussion. I hope a lots of discussion. It's usually also quite emotional, these discussions. So, but exactly this was the history why we have this panel on lawful investigations and in the relation and in the presence of cryptographic tools. The history here was that something like 2 years back, 2.5 years back by now, I think the director of Europol published a statement in the press which was very clearly, we have a problem. It was basically saying we have criminals we cannot chase. And I think his intention was very neutral. Then, of course, the press turned it way around, and it turned into something which we want to have backdoors. Then, of course, my director from ENISA said, oh, this is dangerous for network security. And there was another press statement which stated exactly the opposite. And what, of course, then happens again in the press is that the press says, oh, there is a big problem in Europe because the European Union agencies do not talk to each other and fight in different directions. And this was, of course, a very unlucky situation. This needed to be dealt with. So Europol was friendly enough to start to organize a conference and in this conference we actually came to a common statement, to a joint statement, which was saying, yes, of course, police need to have means to investigate crime. But at the same time, this means should not weaken network security, because this probably will make the work of the police also harder, because weak networks will be abused by criminals as well. So, but obviously this, and then of course we got again in the press teared apart for, well, this is a very nice and agreeable statement, but it had no content. At the same time, because we were planning ahead, we also said, okay, we need to start discussion process, what these means can be and what impact these means will have. And we started then back then a joint working group between ENISA and Europol to develop, to look at solutions, to develop solutions. And we set as one of the goalposts to do this discussion as public as possible. And that's why we took now here the opportunity to have a panel for this discussion, and we will involve you very early into giving comments and giving us feedback, and we will collect this kind of feedback, and it will be funneled into our opinion forming process afterwards. There will be certainly what you say here will be very likely be considered in our process, right? So this is the history, and that's why we're sitting here. Let me now introduce the panelists, which have, of course, kind of opposing opinions on the topic, because they're from different stakeholders. And there would be first in the middle, there would be Stephan Krenn, and he is a cryptographer. He works for the Austrian Institute of Technology as a scientist there since 2015. And was before this a researcher in the IST Austria and IBM Research in Zurich. So he is a bit not so happy about titles. That's why I will not say any titles, but I will just use something else. He's quite a recognized scientist. He has an H index of 13 or something like this. So. Then next to me directly there is Philipp Amann. He's the head of strategy and of the European Europol's European Cybercrime Center, EC3. is responsible to deliver strategic and situation and tactical products, including the annual strategic annual strategic report, the Internet Organized Crime Threat Assessment Report, and also Philippe, of course, has worked before in the field in many other places and is also of a technical background. This is probably very important to say. He's a computer scientist and has worked there very long on this. And then our last panelist is Laurent Beslay, and he works for the Joint Research Center and is managing their research activities, which support basically Europol in their endeavor. I'll give now everybody, starting by Philippe, a short period of time for their opening statement. This will be their position in pure and maybe also very controversial. That I don't know. Well, let's see. Then after this, every opening statement, the candidates will have the chance to give a rebuttal to the panel here on the stage. And after this round of rebuttals, we will open to the public. For the public discussion, we have this agreement already among us to keep the discussion as well as civil as possible, and as we have that a very simple rule. We want to avoid extreme case discussion. So this means for the privacy enhancing technology people, not so much discussion on the NSA, and this means for the law enforcement people, not so much discussion on child pornography. So I mean, so the mics are very, yeah, okay.
Fine?
Yeah, it's yours.
Well, thank you, Stefan, for the, is that switched on?
This works.
I'll do that then. I'll use that one. Thank you. Well, thank you, Stefan, for the introduction, and thank you for having me on this panel. So Philippe Amann, work with the European Cybercrime Center. I thought I'd give you a short introduction of who we are, what we do. So we're part of Europol, Europol being the EU's law enforcement agency. We're not the European FBI, meaning, as our director would say, we're the Uber of law enforcement. We don't have law enforcement capacities per se, which means I can't arrest people. So it's really here to support member states in their investigations. I think that's a big important point to make. Europol and EC3, by extension, we're a hub for information intelligence, for expertise, and providing the needed support to member states. And it's usually Europol and EC3 again become active in the area of serious organized crime. So that means involving 2 or more member states or terrorism. So just to set the scene, in 2012, the first discussion started whether the EU should have its own center to combat cybercrime. Obviously, the decision was yes. And the decision was also to have this as part of Europol. So as of January 2013, you have the European Cybercrime Center as part of Europol, looking at 3 mandated areas. One of them being combating child sexual abuse online. Second one being high-tech crime, combating, things, looking into things like including attacks against critical infrastructure. And the third area is payment fraud, online payment fraud, including ATM malware, including stolen credit card no present fraud, card present fraud, all these kind of things. We have EC3 has 3 areas. One of them would be strategy, but the main part is really operations. So that's where we do the operational stuff. And as Stefan said, we do a lot of forward-looking analysis in the area of strategy, but also prevention and awareness. So that's also the link to encryption, because there obviously strong encryption is very important for us. So if I had to really sum it up for us, it's encryption is a dichotomy for law enforcement in the sense that we do support strong encryption because that solves the prevention awareness part and is a big important element of a secure and safe cyberspace. Actually, that's also the title of our working group. It's not the working group on encryption, it's a working group on security and safety in cyberspace to really see how we can use encryption and promote the use of strong encryption But then, of course, the other part for law enforcement is how do we still can investigate criminal activity online, not just online, but criminal activity in general, which, of course, is linked to the fact, and that's now a trend that we observe in our operations, is that the increased abuse of encryption and anonymity services and tools by criminals. So one of the things we do, you mentioned the IOCTA is the last one in 2016, had a number of key trends. None of them would surprise you. It would be things like, what are we seeing in the EU? It's business process compromise, CEO fraud, it's ransomware, it's crime as a service, meaning the industrialization of cybercrime. So you purchase the tools and services online basically to commit cybercrime. We have some interesting case examples that really show how that works in practice. Operation Avalanche would be one of them. And abuse of cryptocurrencies. So there is this common theme, and we see that in general, depending on the area you look at, there is certainly an increase in operational security by criminals. So that's the worrying part for us, is how do we maintain our capabilities? How do we actually apply good old police techniques? Because that's one of the arguments we usually get. Why don't you go back to the good old days? It's like, well, that's what we want to do. We want to be able to lawfully intercept communication with a legal warrant, and that's where we're now facing a situation where increasingly that's no longer possible. And I don't think that's too controversial, but that from where we stand, that's the issue that we're having, that we're seeing that increased abuse, and we need that public discussion also, and we seek that public discussion to see what. How can we find that? I know you don't like the word balance, but how do we find that balance, if you will, where we can still do our job while preserving and respecting fundamental rights? And I think part of that is also I think we need to change the narrative a little bit. And I'll just give you very briefly what law enforcement is not interested in doing. Law enforcement is not interested in bulk data collection. We're not interested in mass surveillance. If anything, then law enforcement faces a volume challenge already. If you turn around and say, hey, by the way, you're going to get 10 gigabytes more of data every day, I think everyone will say, well, are you crazy? We already have this backlog. So if anything, and that's also the official position of Europol, which, by the way, has one of the strongest data protection regime globally in law enforcement, is that good privacy data protection actually leads to better investigations, better data. It requires you to look at all the range of possibilities that you have to investigate a criminal. So for us, that's something positive. So we're not, as said, interested in mass surveillance or anything, but we are interested in prevention of crime, in deterrence of crime, in disrupting of crime, and then the gold standard for law enforcement would be, of course, investigation, prosecution. But the primary focus, also from a law enforcement perspective, is on prevention, because it's always better to prevent a crime than to have to investigate it. And that's where obviously strong encryption plays a big role, because it does increase cybersecurity, and it minimizes attack possibilities for criminals. So I'll stop there, and happy to give the floor to the next.
Yeah, thank you for this statement. Yeah. No, I think actually it makes now a lot of sense to shortly introduce what Laurent is doing to support this process which Philip just described.
Okay. Yes, it's working. So my name is Laurent Beslay. Just to complement a little bit the introduction provided by Stefan, as Stefan said, I'm working for the Joint Research Center, which is one of the Directorate General of the European Commission. So I'm working for the European Commission. I'm proud of it. More specifically, I'm working in a unit dealing with cyber and digital security of the citizen. And in this unit, I'm in charge of the project related to technology used or possibly used by law enforcement. How this has been triggered, the Commission adopted in 2013 an EU cyber security strategy. And if you take a look at this strategy, I don't remember the page number, but there is somewhere written. DGGRC will provide support to Europol and EC3 from this scientific and technological point of view. So based on this statement decision, we start to initiate some research activity in this field. What I would like to say, a couple of words about the topic and about the challenges from a research point of view. So yes, we are trying to conduct research on these techniques to assess the performance of existing technique, of emerging techniques, but also from time to time we are trying to be creative and to innovate ourselves as well. In doing so, we are facing a couple of big challenges. The first one is whenever you are developing, let's say, an application, an algorithm, you need data. And not only DOMI data, but you need real data. And this is a clear challenge. I was going to give you an illustrative example with child abuse, but it's forbidden. So although it's part of, well, the big part of the activity of my team, but anyway, as you can imagine, it's difficult to process this data. We don't have the legal framework to do it. So we need to find ways to adequately assess whatever prototype we are developing with this kind of data. It is true for this forbidden topic, but it's also true for encryption. I don't have at my disposal, let's say, encrypted file from real cases I can play with. Of course, I can create some, but it's never the same as real data. What is true for this child abuse cases, it's also true for encryption, which is intertwined, by the way, but it's also true for biometrics, which is another activity of my team, on fingerprints, for example, where we are assessing the quality of some algorithm, the performance of this algorithm. Very difficult to do this without fingerprints. So we need to process data as well there. Another challenge faced by this activity is publication. It's not so easy to publish some results on those techniques. So yes, of course, there are some workarounds. You can have a very theoretical approach to speak about the strength of the password instead of password recovery process. But still, it's a kind of a challenge, and it's not so easy to find ways to publish this kind of things, although it's needed in order to have peer-reviewed, or self-be evaluated by our peers, and this need to be further investigated. Last but not least, it's intertwined with the two first. You cannot do this alone. You need collaboration, especially for this assessment and evaluation I was speaking about. And thanks to the cybersecurity strategy I was mentioning, we can do some collaboration with Europol, EC3, but also some member states, law enforcers. But still, it's not an easy task for obvious reason, for legal reason, which makes sense, of course. But should that need to use some techniques, that, when I say there is law enforcement authority and judiciary authority, they need to know the performance of these techniques, and this has to be accurately assessed. Okay. There is maybe one more point I would like to highlight about the debate on the need to improve the situation regarding encryption from a law enforcement point of view as well. The GDPR, the General Data Protection Reform, introduce, if I may, a new philosophical dimension, which is this risk management approach. So, to a certain extent, and allow me to be a little bit simplistic here, it's not anymore black and white. It's not anymore data personal data protected, fully protected, or not protected. So we are going to do our best to protect the data, but breach might happen. Okay, so if breach might happen, so we assume the fact that there will be incidents, we need to assess again how frequently these incidents will take place, what will be the impact, etc., etc. So thanks to the GDPR, there are a couple of instruments now, maybe to be further detailed, but at least available, such as a data protection impact assessment template or whatever, which will help to implement this risk assessment, risk management approach. And I think we should adopt the same philosophy for the law enforcement and the technique they are looking for in order to address the challenge of encryption. There are some, as Bruce-Nair say, workaround solution or options. There are some circumvention elements we can try to explore. And here again, instead of saying no or yes, let's try to assess it on a hopefully scientific way, quantitative way, their impacts, their benefits, in order to take a clear or the clearest possible decision regarding their use and the range, or let's say the framework in which this technique will be used. Again, the GDPR is offering us such kind of a tool in the directive, the one related to law enforcement processing of personal data. You have this famous Article 27, where you have these data protection impact assessments elements introduced, which can be used. There are other elements, of course, but my point I would like to defend here is, yes, there are some obvious techniques proposed in the past which are definitely linked to mass surveillance and definitely not acceptable. But regarding other techniques, maybe we should try to explore their feasibility, their usability, and their impact, of course, but still in a sounded and as I said, scientific way. That's an important point, I guess.
Okay, thanks for your introduction before. So, Stephan Krenn again, I'm from EIT here in Vienna. For everybody who does not know EIT, it's essentially the Austrian version of Fraunhofer in Germany. Yeah, so it's, I think, not so necessary to introduce my organization because it's just an applied research institute, right? But from my background, I started to work on privacy-enhancing technologies almost 10 years ago, and that somehow forms a person, I would say, your everyday work, right? So I'm really convinced by, privacy-enhancing technologies that everybody should have the right to actually use secure crypto, and I have to be honest, I'm super happy to especially hear Philip's statement and also now your final statement that everything should still be sound, and especially you said, I think, that weakening crypto is not the solution, and we should definitely not go for backdoors or a weakened crypto, let's say. So I will not talk about that part now because I think we already have an agreement there. But still, if you look into the public discussion that you find in the newspapers sometimes, etc., you always find ideas that somehow law enforcement agencies should be given access to data, either in transit or also data at rest, right? And let's just look at one example and see that it simply doesn't work the way that it's sometimes presented in the media. And I think you could do this for almost every solution that is out there, okay? Let's just look at, I don't know, encrypted messaging services like Signal, WhatsApp, you name it, right? All the tools that are out there. And law enforcement agencies, I agree, they might have a good reason to, in exceptional cases, request access to the data that was actually sent, right? And the idea that you hear sometimes is then, okay, the communication is encrypted, so why don't you not only encrypt it under one key for the receiver, but you also encrypt it somehow for a law enforcement agency, for instance, use some key escrow mechanisms, etc., so that in exceptional cases, a judge, based on a court order, whatever, can get access to the data that was actually sent. And at first glance, I mean, that sounds like a brilliant idea, right? We trust our judges and we trust our system, but of course, in the end, it's not the way to go, I guess. But there are many reasons for that. I mean, if you look at apps like WhatsApp, etc., they're all moving towards forward secrecy for a very good reason, because you should just not assume that your system will remain secure for the, for the entire lifetime. And so you want to have ephemeral keys that you can throw away after communication, and you only use session keys, etc. And now if you use key escrow mechanisms or you encrypt for the law enforcement agency, you immediately reintroduce the problem of having to secure the entire system for the entire time, for the lifetime, right? The second problem, and I think that's maybe also more related to actually the problem of law enforcement agencies, is usually what is used are authenticated encryption mechanisms. Now, if you escrow the encryption key somehow, you would also be able to forge messages on behalf of the sender, right? So how would you be able to prove who actually generated the message? I mean, to me at least, this sounds like shifting the burden of proof to the potential sender of the message, and that's exactly what we don't want to have in our law system, right? And finally, such key escrow mechanisms, whatever mechanism you use, they might work perfectly on a company level, but if you try to scale them to a global level, they're just not going to work, right? I mean, who will get access to the decryption keys, for instance? Is it Europol? Is it some national law enforcement agency? Is it the US, China, North Korea? I mean, who defines who is going to use it, right? And then, of course, you have the problem of the single point of failure, because those law enforcement agencies, they could be hacked, etc. But also from my point of view, the entire idea is completely useless, because how would you force people to actually use those systems that are offering key escrow mechanisms? I mean, law-abiding citizens, yes, they might be perfectly fine and use the system because they have nothing to hide, let's say, and they are not aware of the implications. But if you have something to hide, actually, well, just encrypt the data locally, throw it into the system, use the communication channel, right? And if you strip off the encryption header, force somebody to prove that try to prove that it was a ciphertext and not just random garbage that you sent over the channel. So in the end, I think those entire mechanisms, they simply do not work, okay? And you could go for any other cryptographically sound solution where you can give a formal security proof, at least. That's what we are trying in crypto, right? And still the solution would simply not work on a global scale. And then apart from that, of course, you have all the kind of fishy approaches, at least from a security point of view, where you use exploits, unpublished exploits, maybe even buy them on the black market, right, to install software on and to compromise the endpoint and the device. But I mean, on the one hand, you again get the problem of proving that the data was actually generated by the person that you accuse of having generated the data. And on the other hand, especially if you buy the exploit on the black market, I mean, you actually know that there are also other people who are aware of the same exploit and who are using it. So you're compromising not only the one endpoint device, but you're compromising the entire system. So, in my opinion, in summary, whatever approach you go for at the moment, at least, or all the approaches you find in the public discussion, they are simply dangerous and immature. And I don't know whether you followed the discussions in before the last US elections, but one of the two candidates, and actually it was not Donald Trump, she proposed a Manhattan-level project to solve the problem of encrypted communication. And I really like this term, Manhattan-level project, because in my opinion, no matter which way you go, it will at some point explode and blow up in your face, okay? So let me just finish this entire statement with a quote from the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. And I think what he says really reflects quite well my own opinion. And he says, it is neither fanciful nor exaggeration to say that without encryption, lives may be endangered. And now the important thing, in the worst case, a government's ability to break into a citizen's phone may lead to prosecution of individuals who are simply exercising their fundamental human rights.
Thank you for your statement here. As I said, I would like now the I would like to ask Philippe to give a kind of a rebuttal to this. I have the impression, I'm not sure without guessing what Philippe wants to say, but I think that Stefan did not really go over the solution you have in mind.
Well, I think you can look at the issue from two sides, and obviously, I mean, I think from a law enforcement perspective, you need to change the narrative also a bit. It's not, as said before, about law enforcement infringing, privacy and fundamental rights. It's about ensuring public safety and losing that capability. So I think we can discuss about different approaches and whether they work or not. But I think there's a very fundamental assumption that I got from you, which I would strongly reject, because the assumption is obviously that law enforcement is out there to get you, and really it's about planting evidence. Well, if we talk about tainted evidence, that goes for any kind of evidence, whether it's DNA evidence, whether that was planted by law enforcement, whether the standard argument of defense, if you have any kind of material on your computer that's illegal, is proof that this was not planted by malware. So the fact that we now have full disk encryption as more as a default means that as law enforcement you have to resort to live data forensics, which violates one of the principles because you're modifying the evidence as you extract it. So that problem is there, but whether it's electronic evidence, and it might be harder to prove the chain of custody with electronic evidence, but that problem is there. And if the basic assumption is that law enforcement is not doing their job, which is to provide safety and security, but to infringe on your privacy rights and plant evidence and taint evidence or manipulate evidence. And I think that we have we should have a more substantial discussion around that, because from where I stand, from democratic societies, I think you'll always have the black sheep. That's true, but we have, I think, plenty of security mechanisms in place to prevent that. That's not to say that you'll always have those cases that hopefully are the exception, but the reality is completely different. It's law enforcement is not interested, as I said before, in bulk data collection and mass surveillance. They want to do their job. They want to do investigate, prosecute criminal activity online, and that's where we're losing the capability, and that's why we need to have that discussion. And that could be an open discussion that shouldn't be driven by law enforcement. But I also think that it's wrong that it's driven by industry. Basically go, well, this is the product, we don't have the key, do what you want. And I'll give you some statistics. In the US currently, roughly 47% of all mobile devices have full disk encryption. Depending on the type of model and the operating system, there is really a wall you're hitting as law enforcement in terms of not being able to access the data. It becomes, of course, more complicated, because then the question is, well, is this the only source of evidence that you have? What kind of impact does it have on the case? And that's where we need to, as I said before, work on better statistics, better narratives to really frame the object better. Because if I just tell you, well, in 75% of the cases in the EU, law enforcement encountered encryption, doesn't mean anything. Were we able to solve the case? Yes or no? So that's really not enough to frame the discussion. And if you see how industry sort of drives the development, then when it comes to smartphones, the full disk encryption will go to 100%. So that's then a situation where you have, okay, there's a potential very valuable source of evidence that is going to be close, in most cases, inaccessible to law enforcement. We had not too long ago a workshop that was Laurent organized, and we had a very interesting statistic from the Manhattan State Prosecutor, and they have about, I think it's public, right, the stats he gave us, Ken, 540 something iPhones that they lawfully seized, that they cannot access, and they give sort of a nice percentage of 10% referring to homicide, 20% referring to different crimes. So, and they also had, and I thought it was quite interesting, it was statistics they gathered from Apple. And Apple, until I think it was April, early this year, and they now removed that, they would give you statistics on how often they've responded to law enforcement requests. I'm talking about a judicial order, lawful process, accessing the phones. It was 6 out of 100,000 phones. I don't think that's mass surveillance. I'll stop there.
Okay, now I'm a bit in a moderator's problem, because I'm not sure, Laurent, you probably want to rebuttal to some of the statements, both of them, but I have the impression that Stefan needs to go ahead and rebuttal this answer first, and then you get your rebuttal afterwards.
Okay, thanks, Stefan. Well, it's a bit hard to reply to that one. I mean, I never accused the law enforcement agencies of planting evidence, okay? That was never my intention, so I didn't want to do that. It's just about the technical feasibility of doing it, and if you don't have the keys, you simply cannot do it. So you take away that doubt, right? And you were talking about black sheep yourself. So you just would remove, or you reintroduce the possibility for black sheep if you have the keys. That's all I wanted to say about this. Sorry for that. I never wanted to accuse you of, of tricking anybody. Okay. Regarding the 47% of phones in criminal law cases using full disk encryption, etc., I believe that the number is correct. That for sure, but something that is important to me is usually the discussion about should we give more rights to law enforcement agencies, and should we, weaken the crypto, should we place backdoors, whatever. In the public domain, at least, this discussion is usually led after terroristic attacks, right? I know we're not talking about terroristic attacks here now. We're talking about everyday police work, I guess. But in the public domain, at least, this discussion is always led after terroristic attacks. And then, I mean, if you look at the numbers, there are, terror victims in Europe. The numbers have been decreasing for the last 40 years, and actually the last attackers, they did not use any encrypted communication, but plain SMS, for instance. So at least when we have the discussion in the public space, I think we should try to take out the emotions and not make the entire discussion depending on, the last terror attacks in Britain, for instance, because I mean we're on the same side here, I think, right? No, you did not. But usually, when the discussion is brought to the public domain, then it's about emotions and not about objective arguments, right? And then just that's a real question. If you to you. Because you said, okay, almost 100% of the smartphones are now encrypted and you don't have the data. How did you do it in the pre-smartphone area when the data was simply not stored on the phone because there was not gigabytes of data available on the phone? You're still very right.
Okay. Laurent probably will answer on this.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Stefan, because I was exactly waiting for this point. What was happening before? The problem is that again, it was underlined in this article I was speaking about from Bruchneyer, the fact that encryption is more and more used in multiple communication channels. Okay, but it's not only this. It's about the fact that our everyday life is digital. Sorry, too difficult. It's become digital. So our everyday activity are put online, and this is a big difference with what was happening before. Indeed, there was not gigabyte of data before because some of your everyday activity were taking place offline and were possibly prosecuted with other kind of techniques adapted to this offline world. So the key question is the law enforcement adapted to this online world enough compared to the previous world you were speaking about? The other points I just would like to highlight as well is I'm not sure we are ready to accept the fact that they will fail also. So they will, it will not be possible for them to prosecute in some cases. So they have this obligation of results to solve a crime, which is a traditional one. But considering the situation, maybe, and this is echoing with the risk assessment I was speaking about. The success rate is not 100%. It's somewhere below. Is it acceptable? Is it not? This is a question which needs to be addressed by the society, of course. But this is a changing of our approach as well.
Yeah, I see there a very, very big need for a short answer, but I also see that the audience starts to want to be involved. So there was somewhere, yeah, I see now also our audience microphone, so I would start to accept a couple of questions, and probably some of the things will come up anyways, and in the end we, of course, will give the chance. Please try to ask the question also in a specific direction, if this is possible, that not every panelist iterates over all questions, because this is usually for all the other in the audience not so interesting. So, yeah, can you, you were the first one. Sorry, I was not sure what the order was.
Hi, thank you all for your introductory statements. I'd like to pick up quickly on something that Stefan said in relationship to Philip, and that is we are indeed living in a new world, and I'd like to change the narrative a bit to question the phrase of lost capabilities. But I think since the more halcyon days of other communication forms where legal intercept capabilities were possible because of the centralization and the nature of technologies, certainly that the environment has changed. And I think law enforcement and other users have to be adaptive. I think we're living in an adaptive system, and I see it very much like software piracy and copy protection and all these eternal loops that keep going, crypto and the breaking of it, and intrusion and defensive measures and so on. So perhaps the change of narrative can be more of the assessment of an adaptive system and how we place our law enforcement capabilities, and what sort of ethical restrictions or restraints or powers we give them from that perspective. And I just wanted a comment after the suggestion of the changing of the narrative.
Anyone wants to react on this remark?
No, I can
Yeah.
I can quickly respond to that. I'll also use that to change, update the statistics. I said estimated in the US is that currently 47% of phones have full disk encryption, and that would close to 100%. So just to fix that. I think I fully agree with you. It's and also to your point, and also in response to you, that's a usual argument that we're getting. What about 10 years ago, 5 years ago? You didn't have all the evidence. You was able to solve the cases. It's not as simple and black and white as that, but it's true. What we now have is a lot of evidence being born digitally. So it only exists in digital form. A case might start in our case with a Bitcoin wallet, an address that you have, or an online nickname. So this is changing, and that's why we need to have these a very agile approach also from law enforcement. And I think, if you will, what we are doing from where we stand is to highlight the trends that we see. And it's something, we don't ideally want to be more proactive and say, this is now happening. The good old things that you say we should be using, like lawful interception of communication, long working, forward secrecy, transient keys, all these options that we have, probably not working, not feasible. So what do we do? Do we accept that as a society, that when it comes to communication between criminals, I don't want to use the word phrase going dark, because that was used in the context of CT, but we're losing that capability to intercept that communication. And then, if you accept that and say, well, we're not going to introduce backdoors or any other means to to weaken the whole ecosystem. Then there are other options that we need to discuss. As we said, you referred to as endpoint compromise, but we would say, well, what are the options to access actually the information again in a lawful manner before it gets encrypted? And the key there is also, and I want you to add that to the capability discussion or question that you raised, is there is no silver bullet, and it's going to be a whole range of activities. And I think for law enforcement also the key points are, the fundamental assumptions are it has to be proportional, it has to be necessary, and it has to be lawful. So if you say you have a measure that is most intrusive in terms of your privacy rights, you're not going to use this for some petty small case, but you need to have this option for the really high-level cases, for the serious organized crime cases where lives are in danger. You need to have this option. And I could throw this question back and say, well, you know, if industry or cryptologists say, you know, I'm full protection, I want to have absolute anonymity, I want to have absolute privacy, which I would also strongly contest, because I think that's always has to be seen in context, just like we're not accepting, unless you correct me, but I wouldn't accept a situation where cars drive around without license plates. You know, I wouldn't want to live in a world like that. So where do we draw, as a society, what is the accepted balance? You know, what are we willing to do? And it's always been like that. Law enforcement has always had that legal role to investigate criminal activity, and by doing so, the right under lawful, under legal supervision to infringe to some extent the fundamental rights of a criminal. That's just the way it was. It has been, will be, hopefully.
Well, thank you for the statement. If there is not immediately, there is immediately another question from the audience, then I keep my question back because I want to involve you.
Good afternoon, I'm Lina Jasmontaite from Free University of Brussels. And thank you for organizing this panel. It's wonderful to see different European agencies and entities working on cybersecurity at one panel. And talking about that, it's interesting that you approach cybersecurity issues from different perspectives, but all these issues kind of relate to each other, so you have to cooperate as such. And it would be interesting to hear about your vision of EU role in the cybersecurity regulation. So what are the limits of the EU as a cybersecurity regulator, and what are its powers? To what extent can the European Union regulate cybersecurity?
This is a question for you.
No. Yeah, but you get me really in a very difficult situation, because we are all kind of technology-driven people, and it's more But so I don't want to put my panelists in a difficult situation, but if someone wants to answer, yes.
Happy, Laurent, maybe you can.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you mind to start?
Little few points.
Yeah.
Is it not already regulated to a certain extent? What I would like to understand is, with your question, you are highlighting the fact that it's not enough, or it's too much, or because you say what are the options. So just for me to understand, I mean, take the GDPR. There are some obligation there. Notification of the data subject in case of a breach, depending of the strengths of the protection which have been implemented. What kind of protection are we speaking about here? Definitely cybersecurity measures. So there are NIS directive, another example, where you have a series of, let's say, obligation, action to be undertaken. So what was the meaning of your question? In the field of cybercrime more specifically, or crime?
No, it's on, I'm not sure if it works. I asked about cybersecurity regulation, and it's more complex and layered. So we have, as you mentioned yourself, the NIS directive, which addresses operators of essential services and providers of digital infrastructure. We have cybercrime, and so we have a GDPR, and these are 3 different regulatory frameworks which all relate to cybersecurity. And it's kind of, that's why I said that it's beautiful that we have like several representatives of different organizations at the same panel. And the question that I asked, like, even though that you are not maybe legal experts, and you know, it's still interesting would be to know what is the role that European Union can play in cybersecurity as an actor? To what extent it can be a relevant actor in cybersecurity protection?
If I may add to that, I think there's a lot of potential. As you know, we have a cybersecurity strategy 2013, and we're actually now in the process of reviewing that strategy. And I think there's a challenge at EU level, given that even at the highest level of the Parliament, Commission, and Council, and other bodies, there is a certain level of built-in defragmentation, if you will. So I think one of the challenges that we have also for the review for the strategies to address that defragmentation. That will then directly, hopefully, also address the improved coordination between the various agencies. And we have that at a working level, but it's sort of developing. You know, we work with Eurojust, ENISA, JRC, EDA now, the military branch of the EU as well, when it comes to capacity building. We just had we're in the process of establishing a task force. I think there's a lot of potential to defragment our approach and truly have, at the highest level, an umbrella strategy that considers all the relevant players. We have GDPR with the NIS directive, so the first successful examples of legislation. But if you take the NIS directive, for instance, we really fought to be part of it. We're not. And I think that's something that should be addressed, because we do think that law enforcement actually plays an important role in ensuring cybersecurity, because we are the only ones who can actually go do attribution and have a potentially more lasting, not attribution, but investigation, I should say, thank you, a lasting impact on those sort of crimes. So, but that'd be one of the concrete examples to say, how can we ensure that the existing ecosystem that we have, that we can coordinate that in a much better way and a more defragmented way, also more agile, comprehensive, complementary, in a complementary fashion. For instance, when it comes to the exchange of information intelligence, we saw that now with WannaCry. The response we had was, I thought it was good, but certainly could be improved. The different players you had the ENISA, you had other players, you had Europol. Obviously, you're just looking at the threat and responding differently. And we learned from that. So I think there's a lot of potential still to improve the current defragmentation that we might have, and also address things like the exchange of information intelligence among those different actors. CERT-EU, sorry, I forgot them. Very important player as well, just as an example. My 2 cents.
Well, I think as the last part I can add there one more thing is that certain parts of this fragmentation are, so to say, by design and are intentionally, as Philip says, but we as ENISA partially we try to solve this also on a soft way by giving our expertise as a service to all member states. So if we start from the same point, there is at least a chance that we converge in the strategies a bit. So this is then what I can add from our side in a very short. But I think there is the next question very much in the back. Yeah. The downside of streaming is you need to wait for the microphone. Yes, please.
Thank you, Philip. Mario Timer from the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights. It's a bit of a follow-up question for Philip. You mentioned the absolute privacy, and of course, for me, it's a non-goer, and I would agree with you. Privacy is a qualified right, and there are limits to it. Now, but what I was more interested in was your concept about changing of narrative, and I'd like your help on this precisely, because This, of course, this discussion is long going, and I'd like to hear from you an ideal case, basically, that you would have come across, where you were able to basically access the data that you needed for at the same time without endangering basically what your neighbor is talking about really at a wider level. I think to change the narrative in this context, I think we need to come with very concrete examples, and that's where it would be maybe useful to precisely show what are the solutions, because for me it's we are in a catch-22 situation. We keep talking about it, we're continuing talking about it, we're doing very interesting meetings, but at the end of the day, so what is the solution? And I believe Philippe, if we could bring some examples, very concrete examples of moments where you really felt very close from a solution, that maybe because of a lacking legal framework you weren't able to reach, but still you think that would have been a solution. In a very concrete case, that would be very useful. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thanks for your input and also relating to the need to change the narrative. I think you're absolutely right, and that was my point about the statistics. Giving these plain statistics, how many times what's the percentage of encryption that we encounter, doesn't mean a lot and it's not very helpful. So we've actually changed our approach as well when we report to the Parliament, the Council, the Commission, that we provide concrete cases to the extent possible. So we would describe how what would be the starting point, what are the things that you need to do, and how many times or when did you have to drop it. So I can't provide you, for obvious reasons, because most of it is not open source, but I can give you some examples where the starting point would have been, as I said before, an online nickname. It would be some piece of electronic evidence that we were then able to cross-match against other information, and by doing so, also using traditional police investigative measures to build a case. Equally, and again, we're not going there, we have many cases where we sort of have this, I need to be careful here, artificial prioritization, where we say, okay, we know from the get-go that the chances of getting access to the relevant evidence will be very minimal, and we have many other cases that we need to prioritize. So part of the prioritization is now actually dictated by technical capabilities to some extent. I don't know, I can't really fully develop that, but I think that there are examples where we were successful because we were able to create that, build up that digital narrative, and then be able to start doing attribution and also use other more traditional police investigative techniques to identify criminals. But equally, we have a number of cases that we always, the point is that we don't start our own investigations where that was not the case. And it usually was because of technical restrictions or not being able to access the data. But of course, if I may just expand the discussion for a second, is of course, we also have issues with, as you would probably know, with data retention. So sometimes it's not even a question of whether the data is encrypted or not, it's just a matter of, is it there in the first place? So that just adds to it. We have, if you're interested, and I'll stop there in a second, is we have developed drafted a paper, joint paper with Eurojust on the common challenges. So we've identified 6 categories, and like loss of data, loss of location, legislation, international cooperation, cross-border access to evidence, and capacity and capabilities, and that's all covered there. But I very much like your comment also, and happy to, obviously we're part of the same work program now that we support with the Commission, but to work together to develop that narrative. We started doing that, and I can continue giving you probably more concrete examples, but most of it I can't, unfortunately, publicly discuss. Thanks.
Thanks. The microphone is walking to you.
It's very, in general, the supervisory authorities are not there to defend, the entities that they supervise. But let me say that, the Europol and the Cybercrime Center have a very defined and experienced structure in terms of data protection. There is people that now Europol is under the supervision of the DPS to some extent, and together with the other data protection authorities, there is also a high level of supervision. So I'm really wondering whether this replicates also in all the national situations. What I mean is that there is a strong protection. There is a legal framework which has been reinforced. There is a continual monitoring of what is going on. By the way, there is a paper that EDPS has issued finally, this necessity toolkit on how to assess necessity in case of measures that are against intrusive with respect to fundamental rights. You can have a look at on the website for that, which is a methodology to assess that. So what I want to not, let's say, to say that we will do our best, but there is at least theoretical and I guess also practical, because I know my colleagues, I also know the experience of the data protection unit at Europol. There is a strong framework and setup around the operations at Europol, so I hope that it will be useful for effective protection, and I hope that everybody, also in the member states, can have the same level of reassurance. Because what I mean is that in those periods of the history where the intrusiveness should be a bit more pushed, or at least there is an assessment by society and the legislator that should be like this, one of the most important countermeasures is the counterbalance of the supervisory authority. What I mean is that the more you are intrusive, the more safeguards have to exist in terms of balance and checks in order to reestablish the situation if something is wrong. Which doesn't mean that the situation should be as intrusive forever, because the level of threats could also reduce, not only increase. Because the flexibility should be not in towards more and more intrusive, but also coming back. So okay, just a little consideration on the situation.
In addition to your welcome advertisements about the activity of the EDPS, I cannot resist, Massimo, sorry. But you introduced the fact that we are looking at more intrusive measures. No, okay, great. Because I was not sure. Because
that was the first point was there is a well-structured and set up in terms of data protection defense within the infrastructure and another relevant supervisory organization on top of that.
Yes.
Once said that, second topic was clearly...
Wait. We have still our stream. It's not...
Yes.
You
have to
can
speak
you just
on the
use
mic.
the microphone? This is all.
The microphone.
No, that was a second point. Second consideration, which has nothing to do with the first consideration, which is, in general, you have more intrusive, it is important to have the counterbalance. So this is always...
As a principle, for sure.
So the more you go inside, the more safeguard supervision is needed.
Definitely, yeah.
So
As
that's
a principle,
the second point, very generic, very...
But what we are looking for here, at least from a research point of view, is to be more creative or innovative in order to have alternative ways to preserve this capability of prosecution, but not necessarily increasing this intrusion capability.
No, not necessarily.
But I fully agree with the principle you stated as well. Yeah.
Okay.
I was just going to make a follow-up comment about data retention, perhaps, and I see that a little as limited as trying to artificially limit the ecosystem of encryption technologies. The cat's out of the bag post-crypto wars. And we have a large variety in ecosystem of encrypted communication systems now, many of which have been named, but there's hundreds, if not thousands, of variants. It's a messy world out there. So, and data retention, it seems to me, is a similar sort of issue in another way, and that is you may start to mandate retention of a certain amount of data for a certain amount of time, but there will always be then cases that are a little older or fall outside of that data set, and some external providers or log providers do not indeed keep that information. And maybe there are ways of trying to continue to find novel ways of metadata analysis and real-time side channel attacks, if you will. One was mentioned yesterday over a gyroscope being able to disclose verbal communications, but that was just one example. Perhaps that is a different way of looking at things, rather than complex, hard to achieve artificial edifices, such as trying to mandate encryption or a certain quality of data retention globally. And it was just a thought, and I just would be curious on everyone's comments on such things. And one of the reasons I say is things like side channel attacks or ways of monitoring or intercepting communications are more involved in the real time, rather than historic archiving of data or later decryption of found files, etc.
Maybe you, Stefan, you look like you want to give a comment at least. you don't need to avoid until you explode like the Manhattan Project.
No, I won't. No worries. Well, the problem that you have with intercepting real-time data or running side channel attacks, etc., is again that you already need to be on the device, right? So you're already compromising the phone again, and I'm not sure whether that's. It depends. If you can target this very specifically to a single individual, it might be a valid way, in my personal opinion. But you know, if it's something large scale and very broad, do you have a comment or a follow-up question?
I think I used a bad example. I was thinking perhaps analysis techniques such as voice over IP analysis that of compressed codexes that can disclose conversations or conversational styles, language, etc. So generic metadata in general, not necessarily just endpoint device specific, but of course in national or regional enforcement areas, there are national and regional monitoring techniques within the communication infrastructures of that region. So, and this exists already, and there's no doubt about that.
I'm afraid it's a bit of the target of the panel, and the other thing is that we might have time maybe for one or more question to the target. Otherwise, I would leave it to everyone to kind of give a short summary what we learned, maybe what we want to learn, or a statement what to do, and would keep my promise to keep the time. Yeah. Okay. Not directly. So then Laurent, do you want to summarize what your feeling about the topic is now after the panel?
Well, I'm afraid I will repeat myself a little bit. So, but no, I just would like to insist, and this is a kind of a promotion for research, but to be creative and innovative, taking into account, of course, the legal framework, what we have to respect, the fact that whatever will be collected has to be court-proof. So it's not about collecting evidence you are going to compromise. You have to make sure that this collection will be usable in front of a court. And so in this creativity, you have to take into account these aspects.
Okay, thanks. I think creativity and in research is a great term, great idea here, because I think again repeating myself, I'm sorry, the solutions that exist are not entirely convincing, I think, and back to the Manhattan Project, right? No, but if you can, I think the goal should be to find solutions that you can really, you know, run on the individual level and really target specifically, and not have solutions that make essentially everybody a potential suspect.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, not much to add. I think yes, we need to be agile. We need to be innovative. Find new ways of identifying criminals, being able to investigate criminal activity online, but also prevent it. So that kind of will exist for law enforcement for a while, I think, but it requires that open dialogue and discussion to get the different stakeholder views and take them on board. And just to repeat myself also, this need to change narrative and provide better facts and figures to really describe what we see in terms of trends and the magnitude of the problem, and not fall into fear-mongering and using horrible incidents to push for something. And I agree with that might have a lot of negative consequences without really addressing the issue at heart. Thanks.
Well, then I have to say maybe it is the time of the day and the end of the two days long conference, which was probably very demanding for most of us. But actually I'm very happy that this discussion was very, very calm and without any insults or similar stuff. So I have actually more and more hope on the discussion that we can go on and we'll find solutions to investigate crime, of course, and also find solutions which are protecting the basic rights of the innocent and honest part of the population, which is, as we know, luckily the bigger part of the population. And then I would say I kept my time for as promised, even better. And I want to ask the next one who wants to close. I guess Erich wants to close the event. Thanks a lot for the participation here. So I would say thanks for the audience and